Hey everyone, it is Bond here for the Ghost Furnace. Thank you so much for choosing to spend another evening with us. We are deep into the 12 days of Christmas currently, about halfway between Christmas proper on the 25th and January 6th, which is Old Christmas, and almost to the New Year. So really excited to be talking with you guys again. We have a lot to talk about tonight, and really hoping that you guys are all having a wonderful holiday season, regardless of what and if you celebrate. So tonight, the thing that kind of prompted me and Nick is here with me as always. I forgot to say because I was so excited. Nick, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing real good. I'm really happy about getting together tonight to discuss what we're going to discuss because we got some help. But back to you.
Yes. We ask for your guys' help quite often. It never ceases to amaze me how you guys pull through whenever we ask for help or feedback. Because we did some initial searching around this and didn't find anything else, but like Nick said, we had some help. So if you guys have not yet listened to episode 41, which was titled Room 74, it was this old ghost story that came out of a newspaper that we came across that we just really enjoyed because it had so many kind of like wild elements to it. And because of the time period it was from in like the middle 1800s, it just raised a lot of really interesting questions. And one of the big questions that we had at the end of it, and again, if you haven't listened to the episode, go listen to it first. This episode will make a lot more sense. We will do a little bit of a recap, but one of the main questions was this ghost kept mentioning room 74. And nowhere in the article did anyone go investigate room 74. And we thought that was at the very least, a comical oversight. At the most egregious, it was a big problem.
Yeah, it was an unexplored avenue of investigation that seemed glaringly obvious, and it made me think that the story was going to be serialized in the paper that we found it in. And very quickly, I'll say this. The newspaper I found the story in was in Newfoundland, which, again, wasn't really part of Canada at the time. It was self-governing. It's a very complicated Canadian story. But the actual events take place in Minnesota, which is very much in the United States. We had a listener, I'll just say an Arthur in the UK, who found an addendum to the story, this American ghost story, in a newspaper in New Zealand, in the Christchurch area. So it's very bizarre, but it also makes me think, and I'll save this conversation for a little later, that this was a wildly popular story that was making the rounds and seems to have been largely forgotten.
Yeah, and I thought whenever, and again, thank you so much, Arthur, for reaching out to us with this. Because again, like we couldn't find anything else at the time. So whenever he found this, we were really excited because it actually gives us some answers, which is very satisfying. And like you mentioned, Nick, the fact that it came from the whole way from New Zealand is interesting because we talk about how the cultural zeitgeist kind of like changes and how these stories develop and how they move over time. And to find a story coming out of Minnesota, of all places, first stumbled across in a Newfoundland paper and then New Zealand, like you said, Nick, that makes us think that it was a very popular story at the time that probably a lot of folks are familiar with. And it's kind of interesting that we hadn't heard of it, considering how obviously popular it was. Now, I don't know if that means that it was just that common for these stories to be around and they just mainly get kind of forgotten, or if this is an anomaly. I'm not quite sure. Do we want to give a little bit of a recap to the story first, Nick? I waited until you were eating to ask you that question.
Well, yeah, no. As you've said, room 74, a doctor had died at this Winslow house in Minnesota. Residents had seen him about. He kept urging people, especially this
professor's daughter
that was interviewed. This person's daughter kept appearing to her in particular and urging her to go to room 74. The story that I read for that episode from that paper, a few of the things that stuck out was, one, just how modern the writing seemed for 1868. The initial newspaper was from June 20th of 1868. And also that, a lot of the things with the ghost everything seemed very modern. That was kind of one of the odd things about it, other than they went about hunting the ghost with ball and powder as though they were going to shoot it. It was. We also talked about there was a good mix of skepticism about it, but also spiritualism. There was a lot of loose things because it talked about this doctor who was deceased but yet appearing about. It talked about how his wife was into spiritualism and had held seance. But they didn't mention very much about those practices other than for the author to talk about how dismissive he was of such things. So it was just it was a curious story. And there were so many things that, aside from it being very modern in the way it was written, there were just so many things that you and I were said, well, this was never fully answered, or they mentioned this, but then they went nowhere with it. So again, Arthur over in the UK. So yeah, this story has gone quite far in the Anglo-speaking world, apparently. Arthur in UK was able to find this newspaper that he says, because I haven't read it yet, I'm going to be reading it here for the first time. He says it answers the question why the ghost wants people to check out room 74. So I'll get into reading it in a second, but any last thoughts on that from you?
No, I think you covered it very well. And I think that, like you said, beyond it being a very just modern sounding story, I was really struck by how even-handed the writing of it was, as far as the skeptical versus believer kind of side of things. Like, I think when we read these kind of articles nowadays, it's either handled as like a joke, or it's handled from like a serious true believer standpoint where there's zero skepticism. This was the original article was very kind of down the middle and even, which was, like we were saying, was kind of like a refreshing look at one of these stories.
Yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and jump in and read this. Now, the original article that we read, again, came from June 20th, 1868. What we are reading now comes from the Littleton Times out of Christchurch, New Zealand, and this is published a full month later, July 31st, 1868. So pardon me if you hear me stumble upon any words or whatnot. I've got this mimeograph up on the screen, and it says it comes from the Minneapolis, Minnesota Tribune. So here we go. Since the first announcement of ghostly appearances at the Winslow house, hundreds of people have visited the buildings, and occupants of the house state that the strange sights and sounds have often been repeated. As the manifestations were very similar to those spoken of in our first account, we have not referred to them. But the following statement in reference to occurrences on last Sunday morning, verified by 3 witnesses, will be read with interest and furnishes found for reflection. Sorry, that is furnishes food for reflection. Mr. Jewell is present in Northfield and expects to start for California in a few days. The prophecy made by the apparition in reference to the burning of an ocean steamer will furnish a test of his ghostly ship's reliability. On Sunday morning last, at about 8:30 o'clock, I met a gentleman from Stearns County by the name of Second, who came down to see if he could not solve the mystery connected with the Winslow House ghost. He told me his business and requested me to show him through the haunted portions of the house. He is a strong believer in spiritualism and displayed a good deal of enthusiasm in its advocacy, and felt confident that the apparitions which had been previously seen were from the spirit world. On our way to the engine room, we met Mr. Hubert, who accompanied us. We went through all the cellar rooms and holes in the lower part of the building, and all was as the tomb. Not a sound was heard nor anything seen until we went into the room on the northwest corner of the building, in which stands a large, heavy table. We entered the room and the door was closed behind us, and, owing to the fact that inside knob was off the lock, I, in a joking manner, remarked that we had locked ourselves in and would have a poor chance to heat a hasty retreat, if any generalship should, in case of an emergency, be required. We were at this time about 10 feet from the door and had assumed a half-leaning posture against the table. I had scarcely made the remark about the door being closed on us when it gently opened back to the wall, and a tall, ghastly-looking man deliberately entered the room. He was clad in a black broadcloth coat and pants, a satin vest, broken and hanging in shreds just above his right-hand pocket, showing it that it was considerably warm, and his appearance showed what might be called shabby gentility. He was in his stocking feet, which were blue in color, while nearly one half towards the toes were white. His head was covered by a clean and very white nightcap, with very long broad flaps to it like a woman's hood. His beard was long and black, with a very wavy appearance on the chin, while his upper lip, toward the angles of his mouth, it turned up toward his cheekbones in a long curl. His complexion presented a ghastly and cadaverous appearance. His eyes were large, glassy, rolling, and were deeply sunken in his head, and were shadowed by very long glossy eyelashes. His eyebrows were heavy but not large, and his forehead was very high and full. When he entered, I must confess that I did not feel quite at ease, and hardly knew where I was, but recovered my thoughts when Mr. Hubert exclaimed, "In the name of God, doctor, what do you want?" I had never seen Dr. Jewell in my life before, and while he was seemingly meditating on his answer to Mr. Hubert's question, I saw him before me as described. His appearance was not in point of materiality like anything earthly. It seemed to lack weight and substance, and more resembled the gravity and movement of a very dense and heavy shadow. His movements were noiseless and graceful, and he seemed to slide rather than walk, and looked like a man on skates, with both feet together under slow motion. After a pause of a few seconds, which seemed an age, he said, "I have a message to communicate, and have hitherto failed to get anyone to whom I could unbosom my troubles, because they seem to fear me, and in their confusion leave me or forget to ask me the question which you have done. I am not happy in my present sphere, which is one of the lowest, and places me in too close proximity with earthly friends and things. I am permitted, as all here are, to see all that transpires on earth, and our thoughts, like those of strangers in a strange land, are continually reverting to friends and things which we have left behind. But those in the higher spheres are too pure and enwrapped in heavenly enjoyments to be defiled by such contaminating scenes. But my probation here will soon terminate, and then upward, higher, and more delightful will be my course. My troubles are concerning my wife and daughter, who are shortly going to California, and unless they take this warning, they will be lost. The steamer that will be waiting for them on the Pacific after being 3 days out will be destroyed by fire and many lives lost. They must not go on that vessel, but on another of smaller dimensions, which will be safely reaching its destination. This is my trouble, and now I shall be at rest, and I will not be here any more." I then asked him why he had told my daughter to go to room 74 on the 4th story. He said that it was for the purpose of getting her to go there, that she might find an old paper in which was the full account of the destruction of one of the Pacific Line steamers just a few years ago. Why did you desire Mrs. Jewell to sit on the west side of the table? I asked. He said, this I thought would arouse her attention and cause her to inquire about the projected journey, and then I could impart the necessary information. Why did you not appear to her instead of my daughter? I have done so frequently, but although she is fully aware of my presence, she is incapable of seeing me, and I cannot speak to those who do not behold me. The most singular part of this affair is that, although Mr. Second was standing between Mr. Hubert and myself, he saw nothing, although he distinctly heard all that was said. He attempted to elicit some information from him concerning dead relatives, but he seemed not to heed Mr. Second's interrogations at all. His voice was subdued but clear, and his words were articulated with a marked precision that indicated labored effort, and each sentence was followed by a long pause as if he were pondering over the next sentence before uttering it. He then vanished, but did not go out of the door, and it appeared that he had been in the room half an hour. As to the exact time, I cannot tell. We came into the house and talked the matter over, and the above is the exact version upon we all agreed. We are satisfied that there was no optical delusion, no working of imagination, and that we both saw and heard what is herein stated. And it is by Mr. F. E. McBain, T. Hubert, and Samuel Second. So that is very quickly the end of the article. Again, I appreciate you bearing with me, stumbling over a couple words there. This person, this McBain, is the person who had written the previous article. This does answer Room 74 question, kind of. But there is a PS, a postscript to the story. I'm going to hand it over to Bond to read that so I can take some water.
Thank you very much, Nick. The PS says St. Anthony, April 5th, 1868. PS. For the last 20 years, I have combated both with pen and tongue the manifestations promulgated and placed before the world as emanating from the spirit land as mere humbug. Have you looked upon Emanuel Swedenborg's Life of Mass After Death, as the vulgarities of this discorded mind have pronounced Robert Dale Owen's footprint mere affulations of a involuntary, painful solemnity of yesterday's interview is so indelibly stamped on the tablets of memory that it could not fade while life lasts. Let not idle jeers of the acceptable be lured into ridicule on that which is above their reach or beyond the power of mere man to explain. I am incapable of treating lightly that which my sense of hearing, seeing, and feeling incontrovertibly placed before me, and for which science cannot furnish a rational solution. Have for days borne the laugh and jeers of many from whom better might have been expected. But all the harm I wish them is that they had been present at that interview and beheld the awful solemnity of the scene, while listening to the clear, measured tones that came from one whose every appearance clearly indicated that he was not flesh and blood. In the name of reason and clarity, respect the feelings of those who are already too much troubled with this unsolicited notoriety, and believe yours truly.
Okay, so that postscript got very purple, where the regular writing did not, and I saw you struggling with a few of those. Promulgated is one of those weird words. I use it a bit more than the average bear, I'd imagine, but
I don't think I've ever heard / used that word before. Like
solemnity is one of those other words which I do not use. Solemnity was always too much like rural. It just was always a bit too tricky. There was always some fear, like you were performing a stunt. If you were to say it in public, you were quite likely to screw it up. I avoided the word.
Right. But an interesting postscript regardless. And if anything, that postscript I think kind of shows, like, it's almost like a plea. Don't look at this as a object of ridicule. Like, unless you were there, don't judge. But so
it's certainly the most elaborate way of saying don't judge.
Right. We now have our answer. We now know why this ghost wanted people to go to room 74. He has an interesting, I like the fact whenever they pressed him for like, well, why didn't you show up to your wife directly? The ghost is like, yeah, I tried, didn't work. Basically, very like the ghost is very pragmatic. They brought up the seance there whenever he was asked about his wife sitting at the table. That was kind of what I understood that they were talking about when he was showing up at the seances. Why did he want her sitting on that side? You know, the idea of unfinished business, him wanting to protect his family, is a very classic, I would say, version of unfinished business.
Well, I've got 4 things I'm taking away from this, okay?
Mm-hmm.
First off, this Dr. Jewell can't go on to the higher path, as he describes, because he's got to save his wife and daughter. Well, sure, I dig that. I get it. If you were in that position, you'd want to do the same thing too. However, here's a few problems it presents to me. One, it says that events are preordained.
Ooh.
Because the ghost already knows that this is going to happen. Well, one, if there's some sort of plan, if there's some sort of grand scheme, why is this person all of a sudden privy to such knowledge, especially since he describes his afterlife in the shades as being of the lowest sort at the moment? That's a bit silly to me. Again, it suggests fates, and why are you being allowed to interfere in that? It just seems like, it's something about that. Again, with the seance, why does he want her to sit on that side of the table? If the seance if he's there in the room and there's a seance, I feel like it shouldn't matter where she's sitting. He should just be able to get to her or get the message across somehow, some way. I don't understand why they don't mention the name of the ship. Now, I understand that they could be held liable, but my assumption is that by the time this story has made the rounds, the ship has already been out to sea. So I would assume that there must be more to this story yet somewhere in which the ship is named. Otherwise, it's going to, as they say themselves, McBain writes in the beginning of this article, this will be a true test of the ghost's clairvoyance, this prophecy of this ghost. Last thing I'm going to say, I think it's a bit silly that he's like, you got to get to room 74 because there's an article about a ship burning, and certainly that will get my message across. And it reminds me, we had a speech and rhetoric teacher in middle school, junior high school. Do you recall this lady?
That was like 9th grade. Yeah.
Thank you. Wild story. Yeah. I think it was in your class. I have 2 very quick stories, and I swear to God they relate. This woman inherited a hotel in the middle of a school day, and she just left. She apparently opened her door and left. And the class just sat there. Yep. Were you not in that class?
I was in that class. Out? Yeah.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. It's a peace towel. It's great.
She was an odd duck.
She was.
We had to give a speech in which we talked about what we'd be doing in 10 years, and I had some goofy thing about how I was going to play a jazz trumpet solo, and it was going to be just so beautiful and engaging and musical, and I'll just have a massive heart attack at the end, and no one will be sad because it was like, that was just beautiful, and that's how he would have wanted to go, and they'd be right.
Right.
She thought that I was suicidal, and she referred me to something, and I had to do all this stuff. It was a big nightmare. Well, then later that year, there was a community band in Jefferson County, Pennsylvania, I believe it was, or Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, somewhere central PA. Almost the exact same thing happened. They were doing a Christmas concert. Guy had a solo. He had a massive stroke just shortly after his solo concluded. I brought her the article and I handed it to her and I said, listen, you don't need to worry about me because somebody's already taken my idea and run with it. She reaches into her desk and she hands me an article about a family of 5 that were killed in a car wreck. Like, she just had that article in her desk. Like, she just thought we were trading baseball cards here. And she just has just terrible, tragic stories just clipped in her desk. And she just like trading them like this. She was an odd duck. But it made me think, like, that's all I could think about when this apparition's like, go to room 74. Room 74 is where I keep all my terrible newspaper clippings, and get the one about the boat. You're going to hand it to her, and she's going to have second thoughts. And she's like, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't get on this boat when we go to California. Maybe me and my daughter should get on a boat of smaller dimensions.
Yeah, it's just, no, you're right. Because I mean, it's like, it's wild, because I think all of us have to have that person in our life that like is like well-meaning, but like they'll clip out an article and be like, oh, this will be the article this person reads that like changes their mind. And so yeah, I can absolutely like relate to that, but it also shows you kind of like the folly of that. Like but I think, isn't there something very human about that though at the same time? Like,
oh, I agree, because I mean, my mom was very much trying. My mom went through some religious thing when I was young, and she tried to say to me, and again, a lot of people believe this is not me saying what's real or not, but she's like, I definitely believe in heaven and hell because I was a nurse for years, and she was, and she always told me interesting stories about like cleaning bodies and whatnot. She had to clean up after in New Orleans there was a plane crash in the early mid '80s, and she had to clean up bodies from that. But she said, because when I've seen people die, and I've seen some people die and they're happy, but I've seen way more people die and they looked really upset and they looked horrified. And my thought, even as a kid, was like, well, yes, because there are so very few people that want to die.
Right.
You know, most people are going to look upon that and be like, oh, nuts, curtains. Is this the end of Little Caesar? You know?
Right. No, but no, I think you're I think you're onto something there. And I guess for me, the folly of the ghost has two things. One, like I said, it seems like his rationale is actually very human, you know, in that sense. And I agree with that. Two, I think that it's weird that not weird. It's interesting that this spirit has some set of like rules that he has to abide by. Like he's in this lower realm where he can interact with some people, but not other people. There's the co-creative element that we talk about of like, well, if they recognize me, then great. If not, like, can't do anything. They have that one guy who can hear him but not see him. Like we see that in paranormal stuff too all the time, where two people are in the same place but have either different experiences, different levels of experience. Heck, even in the last article, there was times where the father couldn't see the ghost, but the daughter could, you know? So like, even though the mechanics of this are frustrating, there's at least some continuity with it that I think adds a little bit of credibility, only for the sense that like, we don't know how these things work. There are a lot of things in the world that seem like ridiculous constraints that might have explanations. We just don't have a frame of reference for even categorizing them sometimes.
I do like the gumption of this ghost of Dr. Jewel, because if I recall correctly, and I might be wrong on this, he died in April or something, and he has months to warn his wife and daughter about this boat, right? He has months to do so, and he doesn't just put it off. He gets to it. However, I do believe that you do a good point. You do a good point in stating that there's clearly like he's there, but you got to believe he's there before you see him. And I do think too that him being able to tell a bunch of people and hundreds of visitors coming to the Winslow house is a much more effective deterrent and means of passing on this message than handing them an article that they have to decipher the motivation behind.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And I think that, like I said before, this article and this whole story is just so endearing to me, and it continues to do so with this new installment. One of the things I do want to touch on, because we haven't really talked about this a whole lot, is the idea of knowing the future. And for some reason, that's something spirits are granted that ability. I think that there is a distinction that probably needs drawn between. Now, I may just be in this mindset because I've watched like 8 different versions of A Christmas Carol in the past like 3 weeks, but things that may come, and also Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and all kinds of other stuff. There's things that may come to pass, and there's things that will come to pass. We often see in stories a messenger of some sort that is sent to guide a protagonist or interfere on the divine's behalf to help steer someone away from doom. Where that from a literary standpoint and a storytelling standpoint is very interesting and has lots of good uses. I think that you're right, and this is something that I've heard. I think the first time I heard someone bring this up in context to the paranormal was actually probably Jim Harold years and years ago. Was, for anyone who's listened to the Campfire or Paranormal Podcast with Jim Harold knows that he is about as open as you get as far as like he's not very judgmental, and he just kind of like lets people tell their stories, and he's great with that. But one of the things he obviously has a problem with that I think is very interesting is the idea that if spirits are able to come back and give people this kind of news and intercede this way, what gives them that authority and that ability to save some people but not others from imminent disaster? That's a really complicated question, I think. And I think that it's something we have to ask ourselves, like, oh, it's great if you had a dream about whoever came back to you and said, don't get in this car, and you missed a car accident. But what about everyone else who dies in car accidents every day? What about everyone else who died on this? If this boat actually sank, what about those other hundreds of people? Why didn't they have the same opportunity to be saved?
They didn't have the benefit of having their spouse die only 6 or 5 months beforehand, and that's it. It's like, did no one care about those people that much, or is the story that when you die, do they bring you into a board and be like, okay, listen, so there's a grand plan. Here's what's going to be happening over the next few months. I don't know if there's anything you want to try to straighten out amongst the living before you come up into this higher realm, because you're the lowliest form of shades at the moment.
Right.
It's or are they just able to see things? Are they able to? It's like, I'm very sure it's a little silly to me.
Yeah, exactly.
It's as a writing device, I get it.
Right. Yeah. It's overly simplified, and it is a good storytelling mechanism. And to move something along, to give agency, to almost provide that like Deus Ex Machina, like manna from heaven kind of moment. But when you put it in context of like quote unquote like the real world and how that would affect everybody else, it's very problematic. Now that being said, like there's not many things I'm sure of. One of the things I am very sure of is the time does not work the way that we generally perceive it, and our ideas are not right about that. So I'm open to like conjecture on those kind of things. But that being said, I think that the idea of, again, these kind of like grand plans and everything like that, especially in the context of saving particular people from peril but not others, is a dangerous precedent to set.
It does suggest that, next time I step on a nail or something, I'm going to be reminded that no one up there really cares that much about me, apparently.
Right. Right. No, exactly. Yeah. It's like because you can't have one without the other, right? Like either they can save us from impending peril, or they can't.
Right. And so help me. If like my wife or daughter hands me an article about anything, I'm going to have to assume that this could potentially be curtains
Right.
Like, you know, if I got, oh, she gives me a Home Depot coupon, I gotta stay the hell away from Home Depot because that otherwise she's trying to warn me.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, you're right. That's a problem I have with these kind of stories that like does kind of grind my gears, despite how much, like I said, I do enjoy and do find stories like this incredibly endearing. But that's kind of one of the elements that we kind of don't really talk about a whole lot in these things. And I think it's important to at least bring up from time to time that like there are repercussions, because we like looking into these things. We like entertaining them. We like the stories. Sure. We like the history around it. Whenever people start taking those things, those elements as points of evidence to explain how the world actually works, I can understand why people want to do that, because we're all looking for answers. But if you take that as justification and back out a few levels of perspective, it becomes very problematic very quickly from an ethical standpoint. Not passing any judgment on anything, just saying that's something that needs to be contextualized, I think.
No, and I say it makes for good writing to have these rules and whatnot, because it's really limitations upon characters, which makes for more interesting writing. And I can't help in this incident to think about a Stephen King novella I read not too long ago, in which a young boy, very much like The Sixth Sense, he's able to see dead people. They can talk to him. And one of the things that he learns is that they can't lie to him. They're not able to lie once they're dead. Part of it's because they just don't care that much anymore.
Right.
And they're not going to be around for very long. The dead don't typically linger for more than a few weeks, he says. And again, these are limitations on character that make for because they tell a story forward.
Yeah, and that turns into a great allegory. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Superman was always the stupidest of superheroes to me. Because, okay, kryptonite's his weakness, but really it's so easy to avoid that. Right. Like, it's so silly. But then you get the other end of it too. Like, I think it was Green Lantern, and his whole hang up is the color yellow. I mean, DC.
It's something. DC's a little. I think we can all agree.
Yeah, I never understood the popularity of Superman, because really, because the lack of limitations, it must have been the easiest thing to write.
Right. And God, I could. that's a rabbit hole right there. But you're right. But that's sure it. But like you mentioned, like the idea that the dead can't lie. Given that context that Stephen King set up there, people should read that and go, oh, if I'm going to compare myself to the situation these dead are in, I don't know how much time I have left. Is lying really something I should be worried about doing too? Shouldn't I just be truthful? Like, there's something to be gained from that story, and there's probably some, if not a truth to be told, at least a good question to be asked.
It was a good story. If nothing else, it's a good story.
And that's super important. And you see little motes of that wisdom throughout all literature and, film and writing in general and music. And that's great. Like one of my favorite lines from Harry Potter, which has its own problems, obviously, is just when I remember hitting me really hard whenever Hagrid says, like, what's coming's coming and we'll meet it when it does. It's this idea of like, like if something's going to happen, it's going to happen. Like, you can't do anything about it. So like, don't stress about it now. We'll deal with it kind of then. At a young age, that was a very important thing for me to hear. But at the same time, that doesn't mean like, oh, just don't prepare for anything that might possibly happen. Like, I
was going to say, that's not really good advice with the hurricanes coming.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So you have to, you can't take any of that stuff as just pure motes of uncontextualized truth. It all has to be set somehow. And these stories are the reason looking at all these different types of stories is so important, especially when talking about the paranormal, is having lots of different types of stories from different cultures, different times and places gives us tons of little points of what may be truth in specific context, that when we are able to step back and look at it from a more holistic standpoint, then we can start drawing some conclusions that may not necessarily be truthful in the sense that how they're each individually presented, but give us an overall better understanding of how the world might work.
So let me, with all that said,
sorry, I'm getting very philosophical tonight. I apologize.
I think you have something there. I think I've been very crass this evening in contrast. So what wisdom do you take from this, an American ghost story, in 2 parts?
It's kind of like one of those, if there's smoke, there's fire kind of thing, in the sense that if one person has a experience somewhere, that doesn't mean it either happened or it didn't happen. That's one person. But if a lot of people have a similar experience in a place, that means you should kind of pay more attention and look into it further, and maybe bring some of those different perspectives and different ways of looking at things. Because in this story, it wasn't just the spiritualist angle that like figured it out. It wasn't just the scientific angle that figured it out. You need to have all the parts coming together to, again, not saying the mystery was solved, but to get the message across. Maybe that's the little bit of wisdom from this whole story, is to have a measured approach when looking at these things. If you're coming at it purely from one point of view, especially if you're of the mindset you have it figured out beforehand, then you're probably gonna either A, just run into confirmation bias, or it's going to kind of rock your world, because the people that got the message were the ones that were just curious and open about it and just kind of let things happen.
So I see it as you're saying, there's clearly no one single unifying theory. There's no one way of looking at the world and things that is completely capable in and of its own self. And I agree with that. I will definitely say that even as I was reading, in my mind, I giggled that the cocksure spiritualist was unable to see the ghost of Dr. Jewel.
Well, and I think I agree. I thought that was very funny that like the person who outwardly maybe wanted it the hardest,
said he'd resolve it.
It was very sure of himself. He's the one being like asking questions about the dead relatives, and this ghost is just kind of like, whatever.
Did not care. Yeah.
Had no interest in that.
Listen, he's got boats to set fire to.
Right. No, but
what? That's how he knows. The ghost of Dr. Jewel is out there sabotaging boats on the California coast.
Oh my god!
That's what I changed my mind. That's what I'm taking away from this. Don't trust a ghost. He just wants to keep them close, or keep them on tinier boats, because he's setting fire the boats on the coast.